Those of us who cover Washington don't often get asked by our friends about provisions in the Constitution. But I've gotten the same question several times in recent weeks, and so have some of my reporter colleagues. What's the deal with the 25th Amendment? And is it really an option for removing Donald Trump from the presidency? The very short answers: the 25th Amendment mainly addresses two different matters: vice presidential vacancies and presidential disability. And while, yes, the provisions could theoretically provide a way to remove Trump from the Oval Office, as a practical and political matter, that is highly unlikely. The amendment sailed through Congress, got ratified by the states, and added to the Constitution 50 years ago, mainly as a reaction to the Kennedy assassination and heightened tensions of the Cold War. The new president, Lyndon Johnson, had a history of heart trouble, and the next two people in line, Speaker John McCormick and Senate President Pro Tem Carl Hayden, were both ailing and a combined 157 years old. The first provision set a method for filling a vice presidential opening, even though the job had been open 16 times after vice presidents died, resigned, or ascended to the presidency. The president nominates someone who takes office upon confirmation by both the Senate and the House. That's how Gerald Ford became vice president when Spiro Agnew resigned after a criminal conviction in 1973, and then how Nelson Rockefeller got the job when Richard Nixon resigned the next year and Ford became president. It's a pretty simple process, actually, but not so for the other parts of the 25th Amendment, about what happens when the president is unable to discharge his powers and duties. It isn't a theoretical problem. James Garfield lay dying for 80 days after being shot in 1881. Woodrow Wilson was incapacitated by strokes with 17 months left in his term. And Dwight Eisenhower had a heart attack and a stroke in the 1950s. In these and other cases, power was never transferred because none of the vice presidents wanted to seem like usurpers. Now the Constitution has two procedures for transferring authority. In the first, the president voluntarily but temporarily transfers his powers and duties to the VP, then reclaims them. Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush both did this before anesthesia for medical procedures, which leads to the final provision of the 25th Amendment, the one that's getting some added attention these days from President Trump's most vigorous critics. It's about what happens when a president is unable to fulfill his constitutional role, but cannot make the decision to step aside, probably because of a severe physical disability, or else refuses to yield power, probably because of significant mental health problems. In that case, the vice president becomes acting president when he decides the time is appropriate, and also gets agreement from either a majority of the cabinet or some other special panel that Congress could create to take that decision-making away from those top administration officials. If and when the president pronounces himself ready to get back to work, that deciding group has 4 days to disagree and stop him. And if that happens, then Congress gets the final word. It gets 3 weeks to decide, but it takes 2/3 majorities in both the House and the Senate to countermand the president's judgment. For all those elaborate and precise mechanics, though, the 25th Amendment provides no definition or other guidance about what the words unable, inability, or disability mean in this context. The congressional authors decided to leave the language deliberately vague. Some were concerned a precise definition might be made obsolete by changes in the world of medicine. Others wanted to make sure that the elected officials, given the decision-making powers, had wide latitude to make what is ultimately a political and not a medical decision. Still, the debate on the Hill in the 1960s made clear that Congress didn't want those words turned into synonyms for incompetence, laziness, unpopularity, or impeachable conduct. They talked about invoking those involuntary removal mechanics only when a president was clearly and unequivocally incapacitated. That's one reason no one should expect these powers to get used, especially for the first time, in a way that could be portrayed by history as a constitutional crisis culminating in a coup. That, plus there's the fact that a presumably politically loyal vice president would be the essential actor in any use of the 25th Amendment. And in the end, it would take bipartisan supermajorities in Congress to move the president aside. The current dynamic among President Trump, Vice President Mike Pence, and the GOP majorities in the House and the Senate do not suggest much viability at all for the 25th Amendment option.